It's a pleasure for me to be here. I appreciate the invitation, Dr. Master and Dr. Higginbotham and Alan Prasagi. I was here at the Bass 101 conference, and it's just always a pleasure to come into Texas and see what's going on over here. As Dr. Master said, I'm from Alabama, from Montgomery. One of the things that I want to talk about, of course, is how to use what we know in genetics to create better bass fishing. Genetics can be a pretty complicated topic. What I'm going to try to do today is to try to simplify this as much as I can so that not only you'll understand it, but I'll understand it too as we go along through this thing. But one of the things that we're looking at is a way to create better fishing through genetics. Now, this particular picture you saw a little bit earlier, I think maybe Dr. Master showed this earlier, but this is a picture right here of Mike Wynn holding up a 25.1 pound largemouth bass that was caught in Lake Dixon, California in 2006. Do you know what the world record largemouth bass is? No. 22 pounds and 4 ounces. It's still the same record that was caught out of Georgia in the 1950s. And why wasn't this fish a new world record? Well, I can tell you one thing, if it was caught in Alabama by some of our good old boys, it would have been a world record. But I'll tell you why it wasn't. He's holding this up for his fishing partner, who was Mac Wheatley. Now, they were fishing these big bass out there in California with some big jigs. And this fish hit at that jig, and the jig caught it in the side of the head. In California, it's illegal to snag a fish. It has to be caught in the mouth. Now, my question to you is, if you and your buddy were out fishing in Lake Fork, what have I got to say, right? So we talk about genetics. Who cares? I mean, we got a bass this big. What do you think is the genetics on there? You know, there's some really interesting concepts about largemouth bass genetics, and there are a lot of opinions about this and about what should be done, especially in public waters. And we've already alluded to the fact that Florida largemouth bass were brought into Texas a number of years ago, and as a consequence of that, that old state record began to climb, and it's still been climbing. But there are some schools of thought out there that think that if God didn't put that fish there, it shouldn't be there. And I'm a firm believer in God, but I'm also a firm believer that people like us who are responsible for their contingency should also try to do what we can to improve whatever fishing opportunities we have. And if that means doing some selective breeding and using what we have at hand as scientists to improve fishing, then that's what I'm all about. Now, I want to go over just a few basic genetic terms here for you, because you're likely to hear this next time you go to the barbershop, or if you're down at the pub, or maybe even at a meeting like this somewhere where somebody's going to throw out some kind of genetic terms. So this is the first one I want you to kind of recognize. How many of you guys in here have seen the movie Deliverance? You know, all the different plants and animals all have some recessive alleles, or we'll just call them genes. They have some recessive genes in there that express things that we don't want to be expressed. Otherwise, they're not very, that are bad genes. Okay, so normally these don't get expressed when you have a pretty large gene pool and you get spawning in that. But when you get matings between close relatives, then you have a greater chance of pairing up two individuals that have the same recessive gene at the same location. So this increases the probability that you might be able to express something like this. So this is the first of the terms here. The next is called Outbreeding Enhancement. I know a lot of you guys have been in the cattle business. I saw your hands raised earlier this morning. And you know what that means. And a lot of other people have experienced farming activities. You know what hybrid corn is, what we've done in the seed business, and what we've done in other animal husbandry businesses to improve by outbreeding enhancement. And what that typically does, it produces some hybrid vigor. So you're looking at a creature or an organism here that we call an F1. and that is the first generation cross between two closely related strains that produces some hybrid vigor. That's what we do at our hatchery when we produce our F1 or tiger bass. The F1 typically, in most of these conditions, will outperform either of the parents. It has that little bit of hybrid vigor, and it'll outperform either the, in our case, the Florida bass or a particular strain of native or northern bass. In addition to that, when you get this outbreeding enhancement, you typically mask those bad alleles that are present in all these animals. The other term is outbreeding depression. Well, now how can you have outbreeding enhancement and also have outbreeding depression? We've heard this term brought up several times. And actually, this can occur. And outbreeding depression is typically when you're crossing two genetically divergent strains of the same species. And I'll give you an example of that. Suppose we went up to upstate New York, and we harvested some largemouth bass up there that were adapted to cooler water stream or lake situation in upper New York, and we brought those back here to the Texas hatchery and we crossed those with some of our fish here. There's a probability that that cross might yield fish that actually would not be very suited to either the environment in New York or the environment here in Texas. So there's a possibility that you could get offspring that might not be fit for whatever environment you have if you were to cross those that are really genetically divergent. But it's very unlikely to occur between similar strains. And I can tell you this, that as far as I know, there are no data existing which shows any outbreeding depression in crossing Florida and native bass. We have not seen that, and that situation has existed for a number of years, and usually if that outbreeding depression is going to occur, it will occur within several generations. Now we know that genetics can influence a lot of factors, and that's one of the things we want to talk about today. What are the things that they can influence? We know, first of all, that they can influence growth rates. That all fish are not the same. All largemouth bass are not the same, and that there are some fish that grow faster than others. And we think that there's a genetic link. Not only we do, but Texas thinks there's a genetic link. If you went on a tour through the Cheryl Unker thing yesterday, one was telling us about the fact that they're looking for a growth gene, that they think that's present in these bass, and that through their research they're trying to isolate this. And I agree with you. I think there is. And if you look in those tanks where they had those fish, all the same year classes, males or females, you saw a disparity of sizes in there. You saw some fish that were the same age that were a pound in size, and you saw some others in there that were 3 pounds in size. So there's definitely something different, and you know all those fish got fed the same thing. We do know through research that longevity is connected with genetics. That, for instance, Florida bass live longer than native bass do. So that's a desirable characteristic. You don't want your fish to die before it reaches its potential maximum size. And we do know that another factor like aggressiveness, feeding aggression, or catchability, as we like to say, is also genetically linked. And there's a lot of data that shows that the native bass is much more aggressive than the Florida bass is. And then there's things like maximum growth. And these are combined by a number of factors actually, but all of them are genetically related. Some is longevity, some is the fact the rate of growth that these fish have. But I'll tell you one thing, that the key to bass growth has already been mentioned today. Actually, the key to the growth of any animal is the very same, and that is nutrition. If you don't have the right nutrition for these fish or for any other animal, it doesn't really make any difference what kind of genetics you have, because those genetics are not going to be able to express themselves. You can have a prize bull, but if you put him out there on a pasture somewhere where there's no food for him, no grass, then he's not going to be able to express those genetics that he has in his body. So the key to bass growth, as Dr. Higginbotham and Dr. Master has already mentioned, is food, and more food, and the proper size food. You see this picture of this big female bass here with that fish that we just took out of the swamp. That's a tilapia that's about 9 inches long. And as he mentioned earlier, it takes about 10 pounds of live fish to produce a pound of bass. So you think about all the bass, brood bass that they've got here at this Texas Center and the Share Luncheon program, and you think about how many thousands of pounds of forage they have to produce to feed these things. Believe me, I know, because at our facility, we have a lot of largemouth bass breeders. And partner, it takes a lot of food to feed those things. Now, growth rates, of course, are also influenced by genetics. Northern or native bass, we use that term interchangeable here, they exhibit pretty good growth rate up to about year 2. Then after that, in comparison to either the Florida bass or the F1 bass, that growth rate begins to diminish. So we know that's tied in with genetics. We do know that Florida bass are much faster growing after age 2. Actually, northern bass can grow just as fast in the first 2 years as a Florida can. Northern and Florida can actually grow at the same rate for the first couple of years. But after that, that Florida genetics really influences that growth rate. We've seen over a number of years that the fastest growth rates, just like we expected in our outbreeding enhancement, actually occurs in the F1s. Now, back when I first started to work with the state of Alabama, and I hate to date myself so much, I hate for anybody to know that I'm actually older than Michael Master. But we did a program evaluating our native bass and just a regular strain of Florida bass and a cross between those two. These were not selected strains, they were just what we had to work with. We found in 1970 that we got F1 bass to 7.5 pounds in 27 months. In 2008, after we had begun our stocking programs of F1 bass, or what we call our tiger bass, we found that we had fish that were 6 pounds in 21 months. And then just last year, in the lake that we had stocked, these fish were not 6 years old yet. We had 2 14.5-pound bass that came out at less than 6 years old. Now that's very fast growth. Part of that's genetics, but the key to that is food supply. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in my next talk when we talk about how to raise bigger bass. Longevity is another thing, of course, that we're really concerned with, because you don't want your fish to die out at age 6. You'd like these things to live till they got to be at age 10 or age 12, so they can continue to grow and reach their maximum sizes. So we know that Florida bass do live longer. This is established scientific fact, and that the cross between these two, of course, also has better longevity than the natives or northerns. So maximum growth, we have alluded already to the story about Florida bass introductions, how this happened all over the southeast in the 1960s and 1970s, and how these fish were transported to California, and how their state record in California was very similar to what we had in Texas, about 13 pounds. And then about 8 or 10 years after the Florida bass were introduced, we thought there wasn't anything to this. Back in the early days, in the 1970s, early 1970s, a lot of us were speculating that growth rates actually on Florida bass could be due to environment, because after all, Florida has a lot longer growing season than we have in Texas or in Alabama. So maybe that was the answer to that. But pretty soon after we began distributing these things, and these fish were in those systems long enough, we began to see pretty clearly that wasn't the case, and especially wasn't the case in California. And we've got a lot of new state records, and all of these state records in Texas and in Alabama and in California, all of those records have Florida genetics in those particular fish. And that's how genetics plays an important role in the growth of these fish. Not only Texas, but a number of other states have run genetics on fish that they've gotten. There are lunkers that have come in. They've taken samples from taxidermy shops and a number of other places and determined that all these big fish they're getting now have got Florida bass genetics. Is California going to be the place for the next world record? Well, it could be. It could be here in Texas, but certainly they've caught a lot of fish in California over 20 pounds. And we know one thing for sure, that in 2006, there was one swimming around out there that would have been the state record. But many of you may be aware that this past year, there was a fish caught in Japan that tied the present world record. That fish weighed 22 pounds and 5 ounces. It wasn't enough for them to make it world record, but it certainly tied the existing world record. And kind of an interesting side note is that about 12 or 15 years ago, we shipped Florida bass from our hatchery to Japan. I would naturally like to assume that that was one of our babies that we grew up to that size, but who knows? You know, aggressiveness and catchability, those things are synonymous to us, but that's an important genetic feature that we would like to incorporate into our fish. And one of the things that we found out is that, you know, it doesn't do any good for you to grow a 10 or 12 pound bass in your lake if you can't catch it. And we've seen that happen in a lot of lakes in Alabama, where people would be discouraged with their fishing and weren't catching any big fish, come out to anything, and we would come in with a shocking boat and just find out that we had a tremendous population of big fish, and these people were just absolutely amazed. There's been a number of scientific studies done. I'm sure this was really hard work by everyone who had to do this thing, but I'm trying to try different lures and fishing different populations and see which one bit artificial lures the best. And of course, Florida bass were the most difficult to catch on artificial lures. Now, this isn't to say that you can't catch a Florida bass. I know most of you have got Florida bass in your own lakes. You certainly can catch them. This is all relative in the fact that if you had that lake full of native bass, on any given day you would catch more natives than you would Floridas. And this is a study that's been done in a number of different states. It's been done here in Texas. Actually, Texas Parks and Wildlife did a study. Texas A&M has done a study. Auburn University has done a study. And they all came to the same conclusion. If you go to Florida, if you go to Lake Okeechobee to catch a big bass, do you think they're going to give you a spinnerbait? No. They're going to have you a box of live shiners. That's what you're going to fish those Florida bass with. It's going to be live bait, not artificials. And in your lakes that you've got Florida bass in, when those things become difficult for you to catch, eventually you're going to weaken enough till you get you a bobber and hook a bluegill on that thing and toss it out there, and that's where you're going to get your biggest fish. So Florida bass are the most difficult to catch on artificial lures, and our experience has been that the older they get, the more difficult they are to catch. Now, this still doesn't mean that you can't catch them. You certainly can, but there are certain days when these things will bite just as good as any fish. There are certain times in a day when they'll bite. But day in and day out, they're much more difficult to catch. So one of the things that we always suspected was that aggressiveness or catchability is an inheritable factor. In our facility, we never really had the time or the space to prove that. But some of the research done here at Texas has shown that catchability is inheritable. And one of the things that they found is that if you breed two fish together that are very aggressive or easily caught, that they will produce offspring that are easily caught. If, on the other hand, you take the fish out of that pond that you weren't able to catch and you breed those, they will produce offspring that are much more difficult to catch. So that links this catchability or aggressiveness back to genetics. Now, there are a number of other aspects to genetics besides just selective breeding. Selective breeding is good, but there are a lot of modern things that have been done. You know, there's a lot of genetically modified seeds. There are a number of things that some people are opposed to. And we have the same thing here. There are a number of things that we can do genetically here, genetic engineering. We can make fish sterile. And we don't do that by, we usually do that by a process that's called triploid, where we make this fish retain an extra set of chromosomes. And this has been done, it didn't start out in bass, but it's been done in a number of fish. In fact, you have a lot of sterile fish that are coming into Texas now in the way of grass carp. These things are sterilized through this particular procedure of triploid. And actually how that occurs is they take that fertilized egg, and there are a number of methods to use, but the most common is that you subject that egg to about 8,000 pounds of pressure for about 90 seconds. And you have to time that just exactly right so that in this process, most of you remember from general biology, as the egg is fertilized from the male, okay, you get 2 sets of chromosomes from the male, 2 sets of chromosomes from the female, and when those 2 come together in that egg, then suddenly you've got 4 sets of chromosomes. Well, as this egg undergoes division in there, it actually shunts off or throws away 2 sets of chromosomes so that it ends up just like either the parents, just like you, with 2 sets of chromosomes. So what we do to make these sterile is that we interrupt that cell division process and prevent that egg from shunting off that extra set of chromosomes. So it ends up with 3. And when it does that, it doesn't differentiate any sexual products. So it's not a male or a female, it doesn't have ovaries, it doesn't have testes. It indeed is a sterile fish. You can do the same thing with bass that we do with grass carp. One of the other things that we can do is that we can do what we call sex reversal. This has been a common application in a number of food fish species. Tilapia is one of the most common, where they make all these things one sex, either females or males. They do this so that they don't get any reproduction. And that way their production as a food fish is a lot higher. Another thing that's available to do is gene implants. We can make a Jurassic bass. We can come in there and implant some type of growth gene into that bass egg, and we can grow the world record right here in Texas. It's not too likely that we'd be able to turn it loose if we did that outside of the pond. But you'd probably it would look more like the penitentiary. You'd have a big chain link fence and the thing would be really guarded. But it's kind of interesting that they've done some of this in a number of other species. In doing sterile fish, say what we normally do would be to make triploids out of these, and we've done this in a number of sport fish species. Actually, we've done them in some of the Maronis, hybrid striped bass. We've done triploids with that in addition to grass carp. But one of the limiting factors in doing these things with largemouth bass is the fact that largemouth bass don't lay all their eggs at one time. You heard Juan talking about their fish, that sometimes their big females will spawn 2 or 3 times or more in one season. And that's exactly what happens in your lake or your pond or your tank, is that these females don't spawn just once. They just lay part of their eggs. They may come back again in a week and lay some more, and may do it again, depending on the environmental conditions. But in order to do these triploids, we have to do the same process we do with grass carp, where we take that fertilized egg and subject it to some mechanism that prevents it from shunting off that extra set of chromosomes. The problem with bass is that you really have to strip the eggs out of these things in order to do that, and it's really difficult to do. You only get partial spawn out of there, and once you begin to mess with these fish, it just doesn't happen that you're able to get many out. So from a practical standpoint, they're very difficult to produce. You don't get 100% sterility. A lot of times they'll be 50%, 80%, 90%, or 99%. So in theory, it's a good thing, but in practicality, it's not. And you're able to actually do some sex reversal with females. You're able to come in and treat these fry treat their food with some type of feminizing hormone to make them all females. That sounds real good. They've done that right here in Texas. Dr. Garrett's done that, produced 100% females. But it's just not as easy as you would think, and there's some ramifications involved in that, some of which is the fact that FDA won't let you put these fish into any kind of public waters or waters where they can escape the public waters because you have used a hormone that's not approved for that. And you could reverse these to males. Now, why would you want to do that? The reason you might want to do that is because if you reversed a bunch of them to males, half of those fry you had in there were actually females. You reverse a female to a male. If you could discover and figure out which one that was, you could take that fish that was a female, that is now a male, and breed it to a female, you would come up with all female bass. So that's a potential. All this stuff is kind of in theory, and it's been done before, but we really haven't gotten to the point where we're able to do that on any kind of a large-scale basis. So right now, in doing females, we're typically limited to actually looking at each individual fish, sticking a catheter up the opening there and verifying that we've got eggs in there. Very labor intensive. Only half the fish you tube are females, and you get very limited number, and so they're very expensive. Gene implants, that's a possibility, but actually that's not something that's going to happen because there are just such tight restrictions on that that's really not anything practical. But you can see how you can increase growth rates by that. But some of the adverse effects you have is that you might impede swimming speed, get a lot less aggressive, couldn't catch them, susceptible to diseases. You know, we've gotten things in here as far as selective breeding goes. We've been raising fish, largemouth bass, since the 1800s. They first moved across the United States in milk cans on rail cars. How they ever got them to California or got them across the states without them dying, I'm not really sure, but I've read some of the history of this, and passengers used to take turns aerating these milk cans with little egg beaters. Yeah, it was really interesting. So you've got growth rates and aggressiveness that we're looking at, as well as Texas. We've done a number of things regarding that. We've been selecting our fish for aggressive behavior for a number of generations. So we've got a select strain of native bass that we cross with a select strain of Florida bass. And that selected strain is based on the same premises that Texas does. We like to get big fish that we know have the capability of growing big, using their offspring for brooders. So you're looking at hybridization. You know, really you're looking at if you do between two similar species like blue channel hybrids, but really what we're talking about in bass is between subspecies. So we come out with what we call our F1 tiger bass. And that's what some of these, you can actually cross different species of bass. Over 20 years ago, Illinois crossed a smallmouth bass with a largemouth bass. They came out with a fish that was so aggressive and so mean, they called it a mean mouth bass. The thing was reported to be able to attack swimmers and small dogs. So, anyway, looking at genetics, you know, one of the things that we have to go back to is that, you know, you need to first of all manage your pond for proper size forage. And when you do that, then the next thing you need to look at is to put a fish in there that has the genetics to grow at a rapid rate and to bite your hook.